Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, thank you for coming out today. I'm really excited about this panel. I think we have what looks to be a really interesting and good discussion, hopefully something that will also lead to some change. First thing I want to do is give some acknowledgments to all the people who have helped out in this report. Go Big Read and the Department of Urban and Regional Planning for sponsoring this event. Also, obviously want to thank Tenant Resource Center, without whom support we would not be able to do this research. And all the people and organizations that we met with, State Representative Chris Taylor, Matt Walker from the Department of Planning and Community and Economic Development, the Bayview Foundation, Commonwealth Development, Community Action Coalition for South Central Wisconsin, Independent Living, Moving Out, Port St. Vincent de Paul, Stonehouse Development, the Road Home, Dane County, YWCA Madison. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not also acknowledge my co-authors on this report, the students in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Ian, Lexa, Emily, Rwanda, Sheila, and Taylor. They put in a tremendous amount of work. So I want to thank them for all of their effort and labor toward this end. Really briefly, I want to go over the program for today. We're going to go over very briefly the major findings, the things I think are really important that come from this report, as well as then we'll jump right into a panel discussion. I have questions for our panelists, and then we'll open it up in the last 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you folks have questions or want to ask the panelists something, this will be the time. So just ask that we hold all of our questions toward that period, if you don't mind. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel and then jump into the major findings, and then we'll start a conversation. To my right, we have Mitch. Mitch is the Associate Clinical Professor here at the Law School, where he has served as the Director of the Neighborhood Law Clinic for the last 8 years. In the Neighborhood Law Clinic, Mitch trains and supervises law students who represent actual clients in and around Dane County in rental housing cases, including evictions. Prior to joining the clinical faculty, Mitch co-founded Community Justice Incorporated, a nonprofit law firm in Madison that has provided representation to individuals using a sliding fee scale model for the last 12 years. Brenda Konkel. Brenda is the Executive Director of the Tenant Resource Center since 1995 and has worked at the Tenant Resource Center or been on the Board of Directors since 1991. Among other things, she served on the City Council from 2001 to 2009. Was instrumental in helping Occupy Madison create their tiny house village, is a local government activist, blogger, and has a regular local government segment on Work Community Radio. I highly recommend this because that's all the good information. Heidi Wickleger, I'm always struggling with that. I said it okay. Heidi is a staff attorney at Legal Action of Wisconsin, Madison's office, where she's been specializing in eviction defense and subsidized housing law for over 10 years. She represents District 2 on the Dane County Board of Supervisors and serves on the board of Homeless Services Consortium of Dane County and many other local boards and committees grappling with homelessness and poverty in our community. Finally, Robert Dick is the Executive Director of Dane County Housing Authority and has been working in real estate and property management since 1995. He's been an active member in the delegation to create economic stability for young families, the Affordable Housing Action Alliance, the Fur Oaks Housing Providers Group, the Leopold Area Resource Committee, and the Apartment Association for South Central Wisconsin. Robert has won a number of awards for his work, including the Property of the Year by the Apartment Association of South Central Wisconsin in 2006, for the successful rehabilitation of the Pines Apartments in Fitchburg. Also the Visionary of the Year Award by Emphasis Software in 2012 for his efforts to reposition Dane County Housing Authority. So with, maybe we could have I guess a welcome for our panelists. There is a lot of stuff in this report. And I want to say a few things about the data and the findings before we jump into it. The first thing is that this is an action research project. What that means is that is about opening the door to issues that are important for resolving. This was done in collaboration with the Tenant Resource Center, organization that through the years has been compiling data on evictions through their work. This is something that, in our conversations, Brenda and I had talked about, that she's sort of been hoping that somebody would take this data and do something with it. They run the Mediation Court in Dane County, and they send out mailers to people who are have an eviction case against them or filing, and that's how we got this data. So it really is it represents the work of 15 years of lots of labor going into putting that data in every single week and sending out those mailers to folks who are facing eviction. So without that work, none of this would have been possible. I study evictions, and it's my understanding that this represents probably the most extensive database on evictions that exists in the entire country. I know no other eviction database that is large and comprehensive as the one that the TRC has been putting together over the years. So yeah. And as I said, this is really about opening the door. There's a lot of information here, questions that arise from this report that are worthy of further investigation. And we are hoping that this report really pushes those doors open and encourages further study, further research, more investigation around this question, because there are lots of important issues to be resolved. This data represents, again, it's what we analyzed was eviction filings from 2000 to 2015 and in Dane County. The data also is important to note is eviction filings. These is not necessarily things that ended in eviction or an eviction determination. This is just the beginning of the eviction process. Again, that's because TRC sends out mailers to people who are facing eviction so they can show up in eviction mediation court. The other thing to take note of is this data is not normalized, so it's not divided by the number of housing units, the total population, for example. This is just straight up aggregate eviction totals based on the block groups. So those of you who may not be familiar, block group is a term that the census uses. It's a unit roughly from 600 to 3,000 people. It's the way that they divide up areas. It's one of the smallest units of analysis that the census provides, and so it's a good sort of proxy for a neighborhood. So when you hear me say neighborhood, or in the report when they say neighborhood, what we really are talking about are block groups, but it's sort of a rough proxy. It's not exactly the best measurement for a neighborhood, but it's what we got. Okay, so here are I think the four major findings that I want to address briefly. The first is that race is the most important factor for understanding evictions in Dane County. And I'm going to go over these in a little bit more detail in a second. So, income alone does not explain the eviction patterns in Dane County, and a small group of plaintiffs, around 100 or so, account for a majority, 53%, 52% of eviction cases since 2000. And subsidized housing providers are among some of the top eviction plaintiffs. This is, if you don't mind, I'm going to step over here real quick just so I can see what I'm looking at. This is a table that's in the report about race. And what it does is it divides up all these block groups that we have in Dane County based off of the percent non-white. So it's ranked here. This neighborhood, Bram's Addition, is the most non-white neighborhood in Dane County. Right here we see the number of evictions, again from 2000 to 2015. And then the rank. Where does this rank? What we see here is one of the important findings is that some of the most non-white neighborhoods in Dane County are also among the highest in terms of the number of evictions. We can see here that this Southdale East Badger Road is number one. It has over 1,200 eviction filings. Leopold, Dunn's Marsh, Fitchburg, Cahill, Maine, right there at Cabot's Bend, are all among the top eviction neighborhoods in Dane County. This is something, this just shows the top 10. It's important to note for folks who are sort of into numbers here, the correlation across all of Dane County is fairly high. It means that there's a very strong relationship between eviction filings and non-white neighborhoods. So that the more non-white the neighborhood becomes, the more eviction filings there are. This is another one of our findings that has to do with income. Very common in eviction research to see that income is correlated with eviction, so that we understand that most eviction filings or most eviction cases are for non-payment of rent. And that's pretty much a proxy for low-income families who are struggling to pay rent month to month and may face eviction because they are unable to do so. In Madison, it's a really unique situation because of the university plays such a big role in the housing market. We see that a lot of this is again the top 10 low-income neighborhoods in Dane County, and as you'll see here, they are all located right around campus. So what are we looking at here is basically student housing. This is, again, speaking of that door that we need to open up for future research, is a way to separate these students out to really get a sense of the low-income population and its effect on eviction, because just by this sort of first stab at the data, it's not coming up, and that's just because we're seeing students represented. We're also seeing them as fairly low on the ranking of eviction, and the eviction cases are sort of at or above or just below average for every block group in the county. So there's a couple things to take from this. Is that students generally can access income outside of their household, right? Their families or whatnot. So they may not be facing eviction for non-payment of rent, whereas other similar groups at similar income levels may. Another really important finding is that there's a small group of plaintiffs are responsible for a majority of the eviction cases. This is a couple graphs are superimposed on each other, but one is this table right here. This is the top evictors, and take the top 2, the top 10. You can see the number of cases and the percent of all. What we see here is that 2 plaintiffs represent 7% of all the eviction filings from 2000 to 2015. These 2 are Madison Property Management and Wisconsin Management Company. It's important to note when looking at this or thinking about this that these are management companies that manage lots of units. So one of the things that's really important for us to understand, again, sort of opening up that door to future research, is how many units do these management companies operate and manage. One of the things that will come up on the next slide is that Wisconsin Management Company also manages subsidized housing. So this is another issue for us that we'd like to explore further as we move forwards. These units that are subsidized, that receive subsidies and are targeted at special populations. This is a management company that's working in sort of all sectors of the market, private for market rental units as well as subsidized units. What are the differences with their eviction policies when they're dealing with different populations? That brings us to the last point here, which is that subsidized housing providers are among some of the top eviction plaintiffs. This is an issue, obviously, that has to do with special populations. Some of these folks, like Porchlight right here, rates number 16, they house a number of very vulnerable populations that require lots of assistance. So there's, on one level, you say things kind of make sense that they might be among the top evictors. However, from a community perspective, where we're trying to seek a way to house some of our most vulnerable populations and deal with all the myriad of issues that may come into the household, it raises the issue of what kind of policies these subsidized housing providers or the management companies that manage these properties have, and how are they dealing with eviction and displacement. So those, I think, are the main findings. I have more detail included in this presentation for later in case questions arise. I'm anticipating a couple, so I'll come back to those later. We can come back to these slides if you have questions. But really what I want to do right now is turn it over to our panel. We do have some experts that in the house that deal with this every day. So I have some questions for each of them, and they're open to anybody. So if anybody would like to respond, this is open. But I'll just go ahead and start it off. I'm going to start with our major finding and ask Brenda a question. So one of the big questions coming out from this report is that evictions are essentially racialized. This is an experience of race or a way of understanding race through housing. Some of the people who have seen the report have also asked me, does this mean that the eviction process is racist in Dane County? Based on the findings of the report and your work in the area over the years, how would you respond to this question?
Well, it's complicated, of course. I know that at the Tenant Resource Center, I went through and looked to see who is it that we're serving in Dane County, and we are serving a large group of people who are very low income, and low income, as we've seen from a lot of the studies, correlates to race. And so we serve 50 to 60% people of color in our programs. Depending on which program it is and where we're located, it can vary, but those are Dane County numbers, and that doesn't match the people of color in Dane County. And so it does seem that there is a population that is being adversely impacted by evictions, by tenant-landlord issues, by being low income, by having just housing problems in general. So I'm not surprised by the findings. You know, in reading the book Evicted and in looking at this report, sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, that's what we see, you know, and so it's not really that much of a surprise. And so I'm not surprised that that was your finding, especially given all the other reports about disparities here in Dane County. It feels right to me. As a matter of fact, when I was looking through our statistics, my staff said, those numbers actually seem low. It seems like we serve more people of color than what those statistics reflect. So no surprises here, you know, from my 21 years of working at the Tenant Resource Center.
One of the issues raised by this report is the relationship between CCAP and the use of court records to screen out potential tenants. Obviously, this is something that property owners and managers may want when deciding who to rent to, be able to look into the backgrounds of potential tenants. But when we consider how communities of color are disproportionately policed and drawn into the criminal justice system, so here, for example, I am thinking about that recent report of the Race to Equity report. You know, how does these issues of CCAP and background checks intersect with housing and increased housing vulnerability?
That's a big question. And I mean, certainly, you know, CCAP is a huge problem, and it's a huge problem for housing, and it's a huge problem for employment. And obviously, those two are very interconnected. And so if you get, you know, if you have a criminal misdemeanor that gets, you know, you go into the first offenders program, it might, you know, you might not actually end up with any conviction, or maybe you get found not guilty, you know, that's still showing up on CCAP. Similarly, if you have an eviction filed against you, maybe it was related to that criminal offense, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was for non-payment. If you have an eviction filed against you, it stays on there. And even if there was no merit to that eviction, even if you worked out a deal with the landlord, even if that eviction gets dismissed because of a stipulation or because the court threw it out, that stays on there. And there's not a good process or any requirement that it come off. And there are many landlords in this community, including our public housing landlords, that will use the mere filing of an eviction without any further investigation into the merit of that eviction as an indicator of negative rental history and deny you housing based on that. And obviously there's a racial impact to that when we know how intense evictions impact low-income people who are disproportionately people of color. So there are a lot of issues where CCAP is a big problem for that reason, but there are a lot of issues that relate to kind of policing and the criminal justice, the disparate encounters with the criminal justice system that also have a really destabilizing effect on access to housing and maintaining stable housing. So, and that's a big conversation, and I maybe we're early in the discussion for that. But so you have, if we were to look at maps about where there are a lot of police calls, or where there are a lot of police patrols, where there are a lot of arrests, where there are a lot of police contacts, you probably see a lot of overlap with some of these eviction neighborhoods, high concentrated neighborhoods where a lot of low-income people of color live. And we see a lot of contact between landlords in those areas, and property management companies, and the police, where you have families that have to move pretty regularly. You know, some might be able to stay in that place for a long time, but you have landlords that, you know, are there for a while, and so their relationships with the police might be more enduring, and they might get to know the landlords better than they're getting to know those individual tenants, I think, at times. And the way that the police work with landlords, they're often asked to potentially enforce, you know, trespass or ban policies. There's private security firms that are employed to, you know, be monitoring the presence of certain individuals on these properties. And so there's all sorts of issues that relate to sort of who can be where in the city of Madison. And if you're not the right person in the right place, and you can't prove that you have permission to be there, that could result in, you know, some negative consequence to the person you know that you're going to visit or whatever else, or for you with a trespass citation or anything else. So that's a really huge question, and there are a lot of things to pick out within that. But I think it relates to a lot of reasons why people that I see get evicted. A lot of my eviction clients are being evicted for non-rent related issues. And I know that's a small subset of the larger class of eviction defendants, but I represent a lot of folks who live in low-income housing, subsidized housing, and it's often because of alleged criminal activity or an alleged unauthorized household member or a guest that wasn't allegedly properly following the guest policies, which are being kind of increasingly strict and rigid and impacting how families can relate to one another and visit one another and support one another.
Heidi, is this Brenda, are you in your work at the TRC, are you seeing folks coming in that are mentioning CCAP or mentioning previous records that may be popping up that may be preventing them from getting housing?
Definitely. One of the first things we do is if people haven't seen their CCAP record and they're looking for housing and are having trouble figuring out why they're not getting accepted, we run that report for them and show it to them so that they can see what the landlord is seeing, because mostly the landlords use CCAP as a way to determine if they're going to rent to somebody or not. They check the eviction record, and then they also check the criminal record that way. So yes, it's a huge factor. It's really hard. I mean, those records stand there for 20 years. We used to have a law in the city of Madison that said that they could only go back for 2 years after you had an arrest or conviction record, and that was wiped out by the state legislature in 2001. So now landlords can use basically something from 20 years ago. It doesn't have to be related to housing. You know, there's lots of things that enter into that factor. It has changed a little bit because HUD has issued an opinion about that and is trying to say that landlords have to be more specific about how they're screening people based on that criminal record, but that is just sort of HUD guidance at this point. It's not a firm law that is easy to enforce, that's easy to explain to folks, that is actually in place yet. Some landlords are re-examining how they're looking at those CCAP records, but I predict that most are not. And so yeah, it's a huge factor, and even I think what Heidi mentioned is that, you know, even if you got the case dismissed, even if the landlord was completely wrong, even if it was filed against your 12-year-old son, that record is still there in CCAP and you can't get rid of it. And if landlords aren't looking at what actually happened in the cases, one of the main things we tell tenants to do is make sure you explain to the landlord, look, it looks like I got evicted 3 times in the last 4 years, but I've lived in the same place for 5 years. How does that work? That means that I got taken to court, we entered into a payment plan, the cases were dismissed, and I continue to rent from that landlord. And there's some landlords that use this all the time because that's their hammer. If you follow through on your agreement, then there's no problem. But if you don't, then they can go jump right to the eviction and have you served immediately. So some landlords use it as a tool to get landlords to actually enforce their payment plans. Other landlords don't do that. So it varies greatly by different landlord practices.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's been very interesting to me, and it's come up in the Matthew Desmond piece on Evicted, is that there are sort of different sets of landlords that operate very differently in different markets. So we have some landlords that may be actively checking CCAP and discriminating in terms of who they want to take in and who they don't want to take on based off of previous criminal backgrounds or records. But then we also have these landlords that, they're more interested in just getting people in, and that doesn't necessarily bother them. In the Matthew Desmond piece, those landlords tend to be landlords at the lower end of the market with housing that is less than up to code. Are we seeing something similar here in Dane County?
Yes, definitely. I mean, what happens when people have an eviction on the record or when they're having trouble renting from a landlord, they seek out the landlords that don't check, right? So word spreads about which landlords aren't checking, and a lot of the service agencies and tenants themselves tell their neighbors, oh, I got in here, I couldn't get in at these other places. It tends to be usually not management companies, but smaller landlords that don't check as much. And you'll see, if you look at the major evictors, I mean, it's Ray Peterson and Evan Harrison and some other folks that are small landlord operations. So they don't screen, but then they end up evicting a lot of people as well. So that definitely is reflected in your report. And it is consistent with what we see at the Tenant Resource Center. Again, it's hard to track some of this. The data isn't really great, but it definitely is what we see.
Mitch, when we first met a while back and started talking about your work around eviction defense, one of the things that really blew me away, coming from Los Angeles, an extremely tight housing market here in the country, was just how significantly landlord-tenant law in Wisconsin has shifted in favor of landlords, even preempting local municipal codes governing housing. In your mind, what are some of the big changes and how have they impacted the ability of tenants to contest evictions?
Let me talk about CCAP in this vein. So a lot of shade is thrown on CCAP because it has this information, it has this record. Records go back, and those can be used to exclude and deny people housing. The thing is that even if eviction filing records came off of CCAP sooner, so let's say they weren't stuck on there for 20 years, let's say you pulled them off after 6 months, there are private companies that crawl CCAP, that pull that data down, and they sell that data. So you can't put the information back in a bottle. So even if we reformed CCAP and we changed the law about the retention of court records or the access to court records, the information would still be there and it would be available to people with money, property owners. So what's the fix to this? Because it is rough, and it's shown in the report. The fix is that you could have local legislation that prevents the eviction filing. If a case is dismissed, it shouldn't be allowed to be counted against someone. You shouldn't be able to deny someone housing because they're innocent, if you will, of an eviction allegation against them. But right now you can. And the problem, to get to your legislative question, is that the power to do that has been taken away. The legislature, as the other panelists alluded to, have taken away the ability of the local municipalities, both cities and counties, to pass prohibitions on screening. So we used to have a lot of things in Madison that you couldn't ask about or you couldn't use in denying people housing, and that was taken away. That's the solution to the CCAP problem with respect to records is to deny people the ability to use it against people because we can't put the information back in a bottle, and that was taken away. And when you take away the local rights, and they've basically preempted municipalities and counties' ability to have any screening mechanisms to provide basic information. We used to have a rule that required property lessors to inform their renters where the nearest voting place was. That was taken away. The legislature said, we don't want you to know where to vote. Think about that. So that's kind of a really difficult problem. And it's studying this, it's all about location. right? Property is about location, location, location. And when you can't use the knowledge that we have here with all of these people, with all of this experience and all of this research and all of the stakeholders, and you can't apply that knowledge to address local issues, then I don't know how we fix them.
Rob, it's our understanding that the Wisconsin Management Company manages some or all of Dane County's public housing. While they manage also a number of other rental properties in the private market as well, they're, as we see, one of the biggest evictors in our report. Can you give us a sense about how decisions about eviction are made in public housing? How much say does the management company have, and how do policies such as HUD's one strike and you're out rule make public housing tenants more or less vulnerable to housing, to eviction?
Sure. So yes, Wisconsin Management does manage all of our units, which includes public housing as well as USDA rural development housing, and then we also have a market portfolio that doesn't have any kind of subsidy on it. But they do manage all of our housing, and mostly that's because of an issue of scale. We only have 200 units total, and they are spread from Stoughton to Sun Prairie to Mason. And so it's very difficult for the Housing Authority in order to manage those on their own. So that's why they do. I did do a little bit of research after reading that in the report, and kind of wanted to distill evictions in our portfolio to find out how many there were, why there were. So when you see something like what was the number, 1,800 evictions, it sounds like an awful lot. In our housing in 2016, to date, we've had 21 filings. Of those, only 8 actually went to an eviction. It's still too many. But obviously a minor fraction of the number that they've actually filed total. They have a little over 5,000 units in total. The percentage breakdown of how many are in Dane County, I think, is about 2/3. But yes, they are a big company. So looking at some of the other filings that we do have, 18 of the 21 were filed for money and 3 were filed for behavior. Now, when you think about public housing or subsidized housing where people are paying 30% of their income in rent, regardless of what that is, the thought is, well, how could you get evicted for non-payment of rent in subsidized housing? So one of the big problems that we have is that while tenants are paying 30% of their income and rent, they're paying 30% of their reported income and rent. And we try very hard to educate tenants in our subsidized housing about how important it is to report income so that those can be calculated correctly. And one of the requirements we have from HUD, of course, is to follow up on that. They have a income verification database that we are forced to use. And when we find out that income isn't reported, tenants get into repayment agreements. And what'll happen is either they don't know to report, choose not to report, and then that money is being spent on essentials like food, like clothing, like school supplies for their kids. So then when the report, which comes from HUD, which is usually 9 months delayed, once that report comes back and the management company finds out that there's unreported income, then there is a repayment agreement put in place, but that money's already spent. So, at that point it becomes a situation where we have a bunch of money to repay and all that money is gone. So, of our money filings in public housing, 5 out of 7 were for that unreported income. So I think that's a big problem, something to look at. 1 was for utilities and 1 was just simple rent. So, as far as what HUD mandates, there are very few things that HUD will say to a housing authority you cannot take initially, although being evicted from subsidized housing is one of them. Also, history of a meth lab, that's a big one, sex offender status, of course. The housing authority then creates rules around those rules. So we do have separate criteria. And in fact, Wisconsin Management has an entirely separate group within their organization that is their affordable housing division. So of course, all of our housing is in that affordable housing division. They have different, different staff or dedicated staff, and then we are able to set our own criteria for all of our housing. And one of the things that we've done really hard, or tried really hard to do, is people call it the B criteria, the alternative criteria, where we like to give people as many chances as possible. One of the things that's talked about a lot is owing previous landlords money. So on our criteria, we say if an applicant owes a previous landlord money, but they're able to make a written payment plan and make at least the first payment in that plan, we won't deny it, we won't deny them for it. We do have a credit threshold of 400, but we're trying to get these workarounds. So we say if you go to just one free credit counseling class, we won't deny for credit. So some of that is putting onus on that applicant to do more, but we do try and create some of those alternatives.
Well, I'm glad that Rob indicated that local public housing agencies and subsidized housing providers have ample discretion from HUD in terms of whether or not to pursue eviction. There's 2 or 3 things for which, you know, they tell you that, you know, you gotta get someone out if they're convicted of manufacturing meth, or they're subject to a state sex offender registry for their lifetime, you know. But most every other instance, HUD has said you should consider all circumstances relevant to the case and alternatives to eviction. And a lot of the plans that we see from public housing agencies and subsidized housing providers discuss, you know, say that they will do those things. Madison says it will do those things. Do they? I mean, I think that is a big question. And a lot of it will depend on whether or not they have an advocate. Because most folks who are being evicted from public housing or subsidized housing don't know of these plans. They can't access these plans. They were never given these plans. I mean, they can access them, but if they don't know they exist and they were never provided one, or they can't read or whatever else, you know, they're not going to know that they have additional rights. So obviously, informed, educated, and represented tenants are really important in terms of trying to stop this cycle and intervening to say, wait a second here, you don't have to do this. There's another way. Because oftentimes, whether it's a rent issue or a behavioral issue, if there actually is an issue that can be proven, it could be tied to disability. And they may also have protections under fair housing law and right to reasonable accommodations. And then actually the public housing agency or subsidized housing provider has to consider that accommodation and engage in an interactive process to arrive at an alternative to eviction if that's the requested accommodation. So one strike and you're out is really, I think, kind of a misnomer. And in fact, HUD has said, no, we want you to exercise discretion. We want you to consider the seriousness of the case. We want you to consider the impact on other innocent family members. We want you to think about the likelihood of this happening again. We want to consider whether or not there's a culpable family member who could be excluded to take care of the problem. We want you to consider the impact mitigating factors related to disabilities. And you're required to make sure all your termination efforts are consistent with your duty to make reasonable accommodations. So it's really important to remember that landlords have alternatives. And doesn't mean they're easy, right? But there are other ways to go about this, and it's very rare that HUD is going to be the reason a landlord has to evict someone.
One of the things that we've been seeing in Madison, and it came up in our report, is there's been a lot of increase in, and this question is for everybody, but for luxury housing. We see it here on East Wash and other areas right around the campus. At the same time, too, we're seeing a decrease in the number of units that are, really affordable. We're talking around $500 or less a month. This impacts tenants' options. Right now, according to Madison Gas and Electric, we have a vacancy rate that's hovering around 2%. It's considered extremely low vacancy rate. What is your opinion about this increase in luxury housing?
in particular as a strategy to create affordable housing. This is something that comes up in the housing literature, that you add more housing at any level, and that will gradually filter down to folks who need it. Does this work, or what are your thoughts?
No, it doesn't work. I was on the city council for 8 years between 2001 and 2009, and I actually sat on the planning commission during 3 of those years. And I have heard from city planners and politicians and everybody for many years that if we just build more housing, that will solve our problem. The rents will come down. I've never seen rents go down in Dane County. I mean, it's been 21 years. I've been the executive director of the Tenant Resource Center. The rents do not go down. No matter how much housing we're building, we're not going to build our way out of this. Right now we have 750 people who are single adults who are homeless, who need to get into housing. We don't have 750 units to put those folks into. Like the math on this doesn't work. If you look at what we're doing as far as creating affordable housing, 20 units a year, 18 units a year, maybe 60 units a year is a really great year. But that needs to be 1,000 units a year that we're creating of affordable housing, and that just isn't happening. And any laws that we did try to put in place seem to get overturned by either the state legislature or by the court system. We had an inclusionary zoning law that could have created 10% of all units being built in the city of Madison would have had to have been affordable. But that it got overruled by the court system. I think, personally, I believe that it's because our city attorney's office didn't fight very hard for it, and that there were better legal arguments that could have been made, but we lost that case. And so you can't have those types of laws in place to make developers create affordable housing. You can't use, as they like to say, sticks. You have to have carrots. So basically, we have to buy our way out of this as a local community if we want to try to get private market developers to build more affordable housing. And it just isn't happening. And the harder it seems like we're trying to build more housing, it's just, with Epic employees and having a huge impact on our market, and with students, it makes it extremely difficult when those high rises go up and they're suddenly charging $1,200 for a 1-bedroom. Why won't the landlord next door? Someone's shaking their head and saying, no, it's higher than that. It's $2,000 for a 1-bedroom in some of those newer units, and they're small. They're not even like larger units anymore. So the landlords next door, of course, they're going to charge $800, $900, $1,000 for their units, which are the same units that 10 years ago were $600. So it seems to be really exacerbating everything. It seems to be driving the prices up, not down, by building more luxury housing. Again, data is really hard to find on this. We tried to have a landlord registration where we would make landlords give us the information about how much they're renting their units to. That did not work. I couldn't even get the votes on the city council for that. But even if we would have, a few years later, then the state legislature made sure we couldn't do it and also preempted that as well. So we go round and round and round and round in circles, and we're not going to build our way out of this by building luxury housing. It's just not going to happen.
Just a quick shout out to Professor Paulson for his wonderful affordable housing needs assessment for Dane County. We know that we need to build 31,000 affordable housing units over the next 20 years. Do I have that right? Something about like that. And so if we're building 100 affordable housing units a year instead of 1,000 affordable housing units a year, we're nowhere near close, and we're never going to build out of it. Just to piggyback on what Brenda said, really, the thought that the market is going to fix the affordable housing problem is insane. The market is never going to fix the affordable housing problem. We need our, I hate to say this, but we need our housing authorities are the ones that should be solving this problem, because we have the tools, we have the rent subsidy in order to fix it. But Congress, I won't blame HUD, Congress has underfunded HUD at a really disgraceful rate. We know the reason that public housing failed was not because of public housing, it wasn't because of the tenants. Yes, there was concentration, but it was a failure of funding. They made it so that the public housing authorities could not keep up their public housing, and that the tenants who had a choice, that could leave, did leave. And that further concentrated the problem. And as public housing went became decrepit, the answer was to tear it down and put all of this into the marketplace. The thought that the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program was the solution to that, again, it's a solution for landlords. And I would love if we could find a way to fully fund our Section 8 program. I can tell you that between the City of Madison and Dane County, we have 400 unused Section 8 vouchers right now. Right now, we could house 400 families if our programs were fully funded, but they're not, so we can't. But even if we had the funding for those 400 vouchers, where would they go? Because there's not 400 vacant units. We have a 2% vacancy rate. So it has to be, the solution has to be a combination of market building, but we gotta fund our housing authorities. We've gotta fully fund these programs to the point where I would love for the housing authority to be the houser of last resort for people that were out of options, that could not find housing in the marketplace. But we can't. Our Section 8 waiting list opened for the first time in 7 years last year, and it was open for 3 hours. 3 hours. And now we have enough people on that list for 3 years. We didn't take enough to have it open for closed for 7 years, but it'll be 3 years before you can get on that list. All of our public housing waiting lists are closed. So the top end isn't going to fix it, the market isn't going to fix it, and those of us who are supposed to fix it don't have the funding to fix it or the political will to make it happen.
Are there other barriers, because I'm glad we're getting into this area, especially around Section 8 housing. Matthew Desmond in his piece on eviction has mentioned that he wants to expand Section 8 vouchers as a way to deal with evictions and housing affordability. And if we can't do this through Congress, if we're struggling with funding issues, is there something we can do here locally, or are there barriers that we can remove that could help us here at the local level to provide more housing security, housing affordability, and reduce evictions?
Yeah, I think there's some things we have done locally. Both the City of Madison and Dane County in the last couple of years created affordable housing development funds. Ours, thanks to Heidi. And that, it's not a ton of money and it's not building housing, but what it's doing is it's leveraging other programs. Because the county and the city governments are participating in the development of these units, we're able to leverage federal housing tax credits to get things built. That has been a huge step in the right direction. Again, talking about expanding the voucher program, I think that's great. But again, we need to build more units in order to make that happen because the units aren't there. The other thing is that in Dane County we have a protection against discriminating against people who participate in the Section 8 program. But that doesn't stop it from happening. It's what I like to call soft discrimination, and it happens all the time. And whether or not the law says you can look back 2 years or 5 years on an eviction, if the landlord is doing the background check and sees it there, that seed is planted in their head. Or, we try and tell our clients when they get a voucher, don't ask the first question, do you take Section 8? Because the answer is yes, but if your first question is, do you take Section 8, you've turned that landlord off. And given them that started that soft discrimination process. And there has not been will to enforce that law. So one of the things that the Housing Authority has done is we've actually started buying up, and it's usually cheap housing. We call it our market portfolio, but what we do is we give preference to our Section 8 voucher holders. So if there are 2 applicants, we take the voucher holder because we're trying to create opportunities for people to use those vouchers. But right now, without strict enforcement of anti-discrimination practices, without freeing up more units to be available for voucher holders and the funding, I love it. It's a great idea. I want it to work.
So there's lots of things we could do locally, but a lot of it has also been preempted. But one of the areas that I'm an executive director of a nonprofit, so this is not going to surprise you that I'm going to say this, but it's all about funding. The City of Madison gives the Tenant Resource Center $57,000 a year to serve tenants in the City of Madison, which are more than 50% of our population. That's like $1 a person. for each tenant. That is not enough to serve the needs. And I need 20 more Heidi Whitelightners to go out there and help represent people in small claims court. Because we see all kinds of things every day and tenants just are not equipped to go through the court system and represent themselves. I mean, we can give them information. I'm looking at volunteers and staff here in the audience, and we give that people lots of information, but sometimes you just have this sinking feeling that when people walk out the door, what are they going to do with that information? People are scared to enforce their rights, they're scared to go to small claims court. If they do go to small claims court, they feel like they get run over. Because it's a large number of people of color who are in the eviction court system, and the landlords and the mediators, even our mediation program, but the landlords and the mediators and the court commissioners and everybody all know each other, they're all white, and it just feels overwhelming to people. You're about to lose your housing, you haven't figured out the plan yet. You remember that somebody at the Tenant Research Center told you this one thing, but are you going to spit that out at the right moment where it's going to make a difference? Probably not. And so it's just it's extremely frustrating to see people. We are actually at small claims court, at the evictions court now, starting maybe July, August. We got some funding. Don't have the contract, but we have have a promise of funding for this program. But we've been there, and what we're finding is that people will go through a mediation and they'll make all kinds of promises, which I kind of knew this already, but they make all kinds of promises, and then they come back in and they talk to our staff and say, I promised I'd have $300 by Friday, what am I going to do? And here's the problem. We get $12,000 to help people who are being evicted. That's the extent of the money we have right now. We also raise $10,000 to $20,000 a year, depending on what kind of a year we're having. But $2.6 million is the amount that people are behind in 2015. When we ran the Housing Help Desk, we'd get $1 million worth of requests every year. When you have $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, how do you prioritize at that point? How do you make a decision about who gets that money? So the whole system, top to bottom, is just underfunded. And it seems like advocates who have been trying to raise these issues for a long time have been treated, like I always say, we're more like pariahs than partners. We're more like parasites to funders than we are as people who have knowledge and experience and can tell people what's going on out here, how to fix this problem. We don't get listened to. We're just considered like, oh, here they are asking for funding again. Just last night, Heidi had a resolution to fund $55,000. Right now, the county doesn't fund any tenant services. So she was trying to get a resolution through Health and Human Needs, which you would think would be somewhat supportive, to get funding for tenant services. And guess what? For the first time in like 3 years, they finally listened to her. But she had to back up and try to explain why we needed tenant services. Like they were like, well, what's the problem? Where's the gap? I don't see what you're talking about. And for those of us who see it every day, and I know a lot of you in the room are those folks, it's you almost like it stops you in your tracks and you don't know how to explain it. It's like, it just is. But it seems like it's a hidden problem that, the education is not there. That's why things like this will be extremely helpful. But it just seems like top to bottom, we have a lot of work to do in this community, and it doesn't seem like there's a political will to do it. I rambled a little, but.
I want to follow up on what Brenda just said. There is this sort of heavy-duty sort of fighting and making out advocacy agencies and advocates and even the university and researchers as pariahs. Talking about what can we do locally is hopefully instill a spirit of discussion and actually working on this issue. I mean, housing is an issue that affects everyone, right? It's so basic, it's so important. Everyone needs somewhere to live. And it's ridiculous. I had a speaker come into my class last semester who talked about the legislative changes, and he was involved in passing and drafting and revising these things. And my students, and I pushed him on why, did you make some of these changes? We don't need this. We don't need a law that says if you suspect someone of criminal activity, you can give them a no right to cure notice. We don't need that. It's going to make the racial report findings here even worse. And I'm going to quote him. He said, "It's for payback. It's payback. We're upset. People are very upset that Madison got all of these regulations in that were difficult for us, and that's why we did it. That's why we made these legislative changes. I feel it's just payback, and eventually it'll swing the other way. The pendulum will, and there will be a bunch of more silly regulations." That's how about we solve housing? Not just when the policy or when the legislature changed. How about we solve it now and solve it for good? Like work together on stuff. What's great about this and this report is we've got a discussion. We've got all of you, and I'm excited to hear questions. But there wasn't this when they passed the first bill. They didn't have an open session. They didn't invite people to talk. Before a draft of this bill showed up. They didn't do it for the second bill, the third bill, the fourth bill, the last bill. None of them really solicited this feedback and involved all of the stakeholders. And that's what we can do. And the way that I would suggest that we do that on a local level is, again, look to leadership. The county has has passed a housing is a human right resolution, right? And that's confusing in a way. What does that mean? Well, it means that it's important, right? And it means that the impact of this report isn't that somebody's doing something wrong. It's that housing, again, impacts all of us. If we have people who are getting evicted illegally, we're going to have homelessness. If we have homelessness, we're going to have increases in services. The funding problem is going to get exacerbated. And it's just going to be hard on people, even if they're in upper incomes, even if they're a developer. We have a shared joint interest, whether, whatever side you're on and whether you're, a lessor or a renter, there's actually a shared interest, and that's what I hope things like this, things like Professor Sims' report here can start to generate.
I just want to pile on one little bit. Just on the funding aspect, so you get a sense of how limited the resources of legal action are. So housing is essentially, after a recent strategic planning retreat, determined to be probably our top priority as a firm in terms of what we consider to be our unmet needs and the needs of our clients, and really fundamental, right? Housing is really fundamental to making sure you have, a healthy life and economic well-being and everything else. But my office, we have 6 offices. Madison office serves 9 counties. We have 1.6 housing lawyers to represent low-income tenants in eviction cases in 9 counties. So that's hard. I mean, I do most of my work's in Dane, but we're responsible for those other counties, and we get funding based on the poverty population to serve those counties. So there are a lot of folks in this data, and that the Tenant Resource Center doesn't even send to us because they know, there are certain times when they're just like, I can't take anymore right now because I have an ethical duty to the clients I'm representing right now. But then someone calls in and says, I was illegally locked out this morning, like happened this morning. And those egregious cases, for some reason right now, are really percolating in a way I've never seen in my over 10 years doing this. And I don't know if it's the law change or just landlords are being more aggressive or we're finding out more about this, but it really is there's something that's changed a little bit where we're seeing things that are quite dramatic in terms of landlord abuses, and we don't have the resources to properly deal with it. And it's hard to say no because people have nowhere else to go.
Mitch, you mentioned something that housing is, this last question, we'll open it up to question and answer after this, but that according to the county, and I know Heidi, you had something to do with this, but housing is a human right in Dane County as well as the city of Madison. One of the things that when I think about eviction and displacement, and I think about, the importance of shelter for dealing with so many of our issues that we have as a community, it surprises me that eviction is handled in small claims court. This is the same court that handles commercial displacement. This is, if you stole my ring, I'm gonna try to get it back from you, somehow. But housing, when we think about it as a human right, it seems odd that this would be handled through small claims court. So again, thinking about strategies and getting around this, I'm not a lawyer, we have legal experts here on the panel, but is there any hope for maybe getting eviction court out of small claims court? So there's a way to move it into a different place where we have, everyone has a right to representation, for example, legal representation? Is that a possibility, or is that just pie in the sky?
So there are lots of efforts to get a civil Gideon attorneys provided for people who, in civil cases, who are at risk of losing essentials like housing. Those efforts, I support them, you can support them. They're going to be slow. They're going to be really slow. They're trying some things in California, but funding is always going to be a difficulty. With respect to stuff being in small claims, evictions being in small claims in particular, that's a fast process. It's an expedited process. It's a process that's what it says right in the statute. This is a process designed to be expedited so that things get decided quickly. And in one of the recent bills, they sped it up. They made it move faster. This makes it harder for attorneys to get involved. It makes it harder for advocacy to get involved. It makes it harder for, let's say that you do have funding to help prevent somebody in an emergency who's in need of assistance, who, if we got this person this money, they could stay in their home, they wouldn't be displaced, they might not lose their job, they might not be a drain, they might not be overcrowding the shelters, right? But we sped that process up so it's harder. And that's one of the things that small claims does, and it is incredibly frustrating. And what I mean by what I said before about trying to get everybody to work together and recognize things is all of those extra costs, all of those incidental costs that flow from eviction are so significant and a drain on the community. So if we worked, actually get a dialogue going and work together, slow the process down and think about stuff, that would be a benefit. I think it's going to stay in small claims right now for the foreseeable future here. But the other issue I will say is that we have a law that people pay their rent at court, like they show up to court. The biggest reason for eviction is non-payment of rent. If they try to pay the rent at court, if they do pay the rent at court, under the current law, the judge has to ask the lessor, do you want him evicted? And the lessor gets to say yeah. That's not the case in about 18 states. Research on this is ongoing, but that's balancing the idea of housing as a human right versus property and my financial profit is also an important right? It's capitalism, it's part of America, but you have to balance those two. And in other states, when you can pay your rent and stay in your housing and therefore not be a drain on the community and not be a drain on everybody and keep stability for your family and keep your kids in the same school. That's what housing as a human right means to me. That means we need to balance, a minimum balance, if not put it ahead of just some, profit motive.
Any last comments before I open it up? Okay. Anybody have any questions for myself or the panelists? In the back?
Hi there, my name is Heinrich Easy. I'm only here all the way from Milwaukee. Brenda and Mitch know me. I'm with the Apartment Association of Southeastern Wisconsin. I represent landlords and the Apartment Association. We were one of the big players along with the various Apartment Associations of South Central Wisconsin and getting some of the changes through. We're with you on solving the problem. I mean, that's the clear thing. A lot of us in Milwaukee were very concerned about Matt Desmond's book. I and one of my landlord friends, we spent an hour talking to Matt about the problem and about the solutions. But as you go forward, I think here's what you're missing. Take Arlene. Remember Arlene from a lot of you read, right? She was the one that got evicted right in the first pages of the book. Well, Arlene, she came out publicly. Arlene has been evicted 9 times. most recently in, I think, 2014. Not since then, luckily. That doesn't come out in Matt's book, but it's an important thing to remember because here's my problem, let's say, speaking out as a landlord. So Arlene comes to me and she wants to rent from me. And I look her up in CCAP, and I see she's been evicted a total of 9 times. So I figure, well, you know, she's probably not that good of a tenant. I shouldn't rent her. Yeah? Is anybody going to dispute that I maybe shouldn't, or at least I should think carefully about it? I think not. But I don't leave that just hanging there. I say there is an answer to that. The answer is to provide vouchers, and we do it with Matt Desmond very much in this, provide vouchers for people. These are basic right to housing. If they have trouble running their lives, maintaining their obligations, they should have a right to apply for a voucher, which a landlord then can't accept. Obviously, I'd accept her if I knew I was going to get my rent. So there's that aspect. The other aspect, which ties into what you've done, and it also ties into Matt's book, is Sharina. Some of you remember that name. She's the landlord. She and her husband run a substantial chunk of property on the north side of Milwaukee. The problem that Matt's book has created is in the book, Sharina looks to be very successful. She has 18 properties. She's pulling in 10 grand a month. What the book doesn't point out is that about a year after Desmond was in Milwaukee, Sharina started going broke. All of her properties, all 18 properties that she owned are no longer around. They're bulldozed. They're big eyesores. She is no longer in the landlord business. So what does that have to do with your study? Well, and this is where I find fault with you guys. Why didn't you get more private landlords involved in your study? Why isn't there a private landlord up on the stage talking about these issues? Because one of the problems is if you're going to be successful, you've got to figure out a way, you've got to find out for sure, is it really profitable to rent to low-income tenants in poor neighborhoods? That's a very valid question. And that doesn't imply that it is. In fact, it isn't. So that's where I think you guys can do some more research and some more digging to get to those answers.
Is there a question associated with that?
The question was a suggestion to pursue some of those issues.
No, that's great. I want to put it for the record, we did reach out to the Apartment Association in South Central Wisconsin for input on the report. They declined. And so that's an important piece of the study. And I think it would be great, you know, it's a good point, we should have had a landlord up here. So one of the big contributions of Matt Desmond's piece, I think, is bringing out that profitability at the low end. And that's something that, as housing researchers, we're constantly trying to figure out. We got some hands right here, so
I'm a landlord.
There's landlords up here. I just wanted to say that we, through the Tenant Resource Center and through me being an alderman at the City Council, we used to have a very good working relationship with landlords. We used to meet with them on a monthly basis. We used to bring problems to the table and we used to try to solve them. We started the mediation program together in Small Claims Court. The Tenant Resource Center and the Apartment Association started the mediation program. Something in the last 10 years has gone horribly awry, and the landlords just don't have any interest in being a part of the solution in any meaningful kind of way. There are some landlords here and there, but the Apartment Association, as a representative, has just sort of, they'll work with some people and not work with other people, and it's just become increasingly difficult to even have a meaningful conversation, as Mitch was saying. We can't even have a conversation anymore, and when we're doing research, they don't want to answer questions. They hoard the information they do have about the prices of apartments in Madison, and they won't share it with people. It's just become increasingly just difficult to work with them. That doesn't mean that there's not some good landlords out there, and even some in the Realtors Association and some other folks. You know, there are some folks but they don't have the power, they don't have the numbers, they don't have the sway and the ability to really make the difference that we're talking about. And so, I mean, it's just like all communication has just stopped, and it's just making it more difficult.
Just real quick, yes, I am a landlord, and I'm a landlord in low-income areas, and no, it is not profitable. But I think the problem here, and again, I would love the solution of fully funding or expanding our voucher programs. I think that would be great. We do need cooperation with landlords in order to make that happen, because they have to then accept the vouchers. What in the conclusion of the book, one of the things they talk about is making those vouchers mandatory. And I would like to see whether or not the landlord community is open to that. There was push back 10, 15 years ago to make it mandatory. We've now said you can't discriminate. Well, those aren't the same things. And so in order to have a universally accepted voucher program, there is a lot more buy-in that we need from the landlord community. The last thing I want to say, and I beat my head against this a lot, and say that I get frustrated that we are trying to solve or address a symptom and not a disease. And housing, homelessness, affordable housing, eviction, all of those things are symptoms of poverty, and it is a symptom of income inequality. And we are not addressing poverty and income inequality. We're trying to fix the symptoms or the aftermath of those things. And that's difficult. But again, I'm here in my box with my tools, and I can't fix that. But I want to put that out there, that if people had the income to afford their housing, we wouldn't be talking about these things. And if we didn't have this horrible income inequality and these terribly low wages to where people could have the ability to afford their housing, this wouldn't be such a big problem. But we have no momentum to fix that.
Here, here.
I just want the record to reflect, I think Henry Deasy, is it the Southeast Apartment Association?
Right, southeastern Wisconsin, right?
Southeastern Wisconsin is going to lobby for a state-funded voucher program in this session. Next session. I mean, I think there are things that we can work together on, and that could be one. I mean, that is real. It's not a complete solution in the Madison area because of our really tight rental vacancy rate. You need that housing stock for people to go to, and as Matt Desmond indicated, without protections for Section 8 voucher recipients, landlords don't have to take them, and they can deny them because they receive Section 8. So we have to think about how that would work well. In some places it's going to work well, better than others. But I think there are certain things that we can definitely work together on that are in our collective interest.
Saw a few other hands.
So I would just offer, I look at variation in housing policy across states, that all we've been talking about here is not unique to Madison. There's flavors, but it's a national kind of concern. What I take from the national data, looking at the regulatory environment, particularly around assisted housing, right? All the discretion at the PHA level, I think is probably problematic, even though only those two things you mentioned, the methamphetamine and the other reason why we would be...
or evicted from federal housing.
Right, from any housing assistance program, both vouchers and public housing. That I think there's some leverage at the larger federal level to change some of that, because there's a lot of variation in band lengths across, if you look across public housing authorities in the largest cities across the whole country. So towards the private rental market, there are different things happening across the country, right? So there are some developers working with the nonprofits involved in deeply subsidizing folks at the very low end of the market with vouchers, who are experimenting with Atlanta University to construct a rental insurance product that a nonprofit would pay on behalf of someone at the lowest end to stabilize housing for the first couple of years, because whatever limited research there is shows that it's the first couple of years for renters at the lowest end where there are dynamic problems in health and relationships such that people can't maintain their housing. So my point is that there are experiments happening other parts of the country that could be useful. This is a nice town, this is a nice little city. If you can't figure out how to do something in Madison, I'm not sure where you should be able to figure it out. So I'm just saying there are things happening other places that could be useful. If it works in Atlanta, right, this product, which if it's federally subsidized, this rental insurance product, it's the equivalent of private mortgage insurance for those in the private market. Okay? So there's things happening. There are policy things happening that might be useful. I just offer that. It hasn't happened yet. They're still evaluating, and they're making the insurance product to be purchased to ensure that people who are renting housing are willing to rent it to folks at the lowest end, using the same subsidy things that we use already in our subsidized housing, because we're subsidizing it anyway. Okay.
My name is Mary Brown. I'm with the NAACP local and also the state housing chair. And I've spoken with Heidi as well as Brenda. They know my rant is about Section 42. I marketed the first property in the state of Wisconsin back in the 80s. And apparently, nobody ever thought of what would happen when developers opt out of the program. We're starting to get complaints throughout the state of folks who are being displaced. And apparently there are no resources for folks to access housing. Whoever thought senior citizens would be homeless anywhere? But it's not just a Madison problem. It's a federal problem across the nation. Have you thought about that in your research and looking at policies? I know Congress is involved, and Tammy Baldwin is going to add her name to an improvement bill, but it does nothing now for folks who have spent 15 or 20 years in the program and now find they have no place to go.
Yeah, so we did look at that in the report. It's one of the things that, again, we were playing around with different variables, things that might be important. When it comes to housing vulnerability, we know that elderly renters that are on fixed incomes are some of the most vulnerable tenants to price increases in the neighborhoods. So we looked at that. Unfortunately, what we found was that when we're looking at block group level, the places that had high concentrations of renters over 65, these are areas that are, senior citizens' homes and stuff where there were very low eviction rates. So it just wasn't coming up in our data. Not saying that wasn't happening. It just wasn't coming up in the way that we were looking at it at a block group level. We do know, and exactly like what you're saying, that elderly tenants are extremely vulnerable. For example, there's a few cases in San Francisco that have come out recently of a couple women that are over 100 years old that are getting evicted. Those kinds of things just really, they hurt. They hurt to hear that. Madison also has an aging population. This is something that we're going to have to deal with as a community. Lots of elderly people are going to be on fixed incomes and not have recourse. So I don't know the answer to that, but maybe somebody on the panel has some ideas.
I just wanted to, Mary and I have talked about this in the past, but Section 42 housing, which is also the low-income housing tax credit program, is another example of the way that our federal government has destroyed affordable housing. Starting with public housing, and then, we use the tax credit program, we're using it to build housing, and we're happy that it's there. But it is a program that was designed by developers for developers. It is not truly affordable. It is only affordable if you are at a break point. If the housing is set aside for people at or below 60% of county median income, it is only affordable if you are exactly at 60%. If you are at 59, 58, 40, it's no longer affordable because it's not 30% of your income. It's not subsidized. All it is rent limits and rent caps. And it is diverting federal dollars that could be used to actually subsidize housing and putting it into developers' pockets. We use the program at the Housing Authority to try and develop housing. We get those developer fees, but we turn them back around and churn them back to try and create more housing. But for the vast majority of Section 42 tax credit programs that are built, they are built for those developer fees. That's why they do it. That's why they use the program. And after 15 years, the developer doesn't care anymore because they've gotten their tax credits and they want to get out. And it is not about affordable housing, it's about developers.
I'm glad he said that. But I also wanted to just throw in there, my staff, the Tenant Resource Center, live in that affordable housing. It's not cheap in Madison. It is market rate housing, and it really doesn't help people. We have a very high area median income because of all the state workers and other folks, and so when they say it's at 60% of the median income, that makes it market rate housing. So it's still a one-bedroom at, I don't remember the numbers now, but it's $800 or $900 a month. And so a lot of people get turned away from that because they don't make enough income to be able to afford the Section 42 affordable housing. And so it's not really a program that's working for folks.
I think Mary's point is a good one, though, that, when we're talking about eviction and we're talking about housing instability, we need, yes, our strategies need to include creation of new affordable housing units and eviction alternatives, but also preservation of existing affordable housing, right? Because we're not getting anywhere if we're building and losing at the same time. And how does those opt-outs, how do those, expirations impact people? Is anyone reaching out to them to notify them, to assist them, to find new housing for them, to figure out if there's a way they could, age in place where they are, where they've lived, where, and that needs to be part of the plan, absolutely.
So I really appreciate Rob identifying that the root cause is below, right, affordable housing or eviction. That this is a symptom of a systemic problem, and that the root cause is around socioeconomic inequality. So, and I love that we have experts in the room. Kurt Paulson at last year's Dane County Housing Authority meeting, and then Mark Curtis at this year's. We have experts coming in, telling us all this valuable information, and we can do the root cause analysis. But what can we do in terms of carrots, like you mentioned before, Brenda? What incentives are available, or are there ways, putting on a socio-entrepreneur hat, what ways can we innovate to also create solutions from the bottom up, so we don't always have to rely on policy driving or people with lots of money and their pocketbooks driving the conversation? What if we take, are there innovative models out there like what Mara mentioned? And she also tells us, right, if you don't have housing stability, you have lower health outcomes, right? And a bunch of other derivative effects if we lose that basic need. So the point being, do you guys know of any innovative models? Brenda, I know you're involved with tiny homes. How can we as a community add more incentives like that, or more innovative types of affordable housing? Or think about, can the city offer a carrot in the form of homeowners to open up their rooms like an Airbnb if they want to create a supportive environment? I don't know, do you guys have any comments on that?
You have to remember, I've been doing this for 21 years, and it feels like sometimes that we've tried a lot of everything that we can come up with. Heidi just sent out an email this morning saying, hey, it seems like, we started out as a community really advocating for affordable housing, and when we started advocating for affordable housing, we were trying to get it from 80% AMI down to 60% AMI. We know the real issues are way down at 30% AMI and lower, or people with no income at all, and people who have been cut off their food stamps and all those types of things. And it feels like between all the constraints of everything that have been sort of changed over the last few years, it's making it incredibly difficult that even the politicians will just say the only way to create affordable housing is with RETA tax credits. I can't believe that is true. I just don't believe that that's true. I do think that supporting our local housing authorities is a major key to making this happen. I think that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or the Affordable Housing Funds, not trust funds, the Affordable Housing Funds that the city and county are putting forward are making a huge difference, but we need to multiply that by 10. It really is it's a money issue, and it's a priority issue, and is this going to be a priority? Are we going to create, do we need to rebuild the Central Library and build Judge Doyle Square, or do we need to build affordable housing? And it is a choice of our policymakers about where they want to put their dollars. We can't just buy our way out of it. We do need the other legislative things that can be done to keep people in place to prevent the high costs that they have. And then there are other models. I'm sort of frustrated that, we were talking about this morning, we don't have single room occupancy units anymore because most of the nonprofit developers don't want to build them. But that is a solution. Micro housing, tiny houses, SRO housing, those types of things cost less money. when we build housing out on LI Drive and it costs $200,000 a unit, I cringe, and Rob is too, because it's just a ridiculous amount of money to be spending for a unit when we know we can do it cheaper, but it's all about the developer's fees and other things that go into it, and government trying to create the housing can be incredibly cumbersome and not beneficial. We do need to get developers to build it, but like, you know, our inclusionary zoning law repealed, it's like, it feels like sometimes we have tried a lot, and Heidi is trying to get a group together to talk about, okay, let's go back to affordable housing and try to figure out how to advocate harder for that. And I think we need not just the advocates who do this every day, but the community to stand up and say, we've had enough. Affordable housing is, I mean, Mayor Dave heard that in 2009, but didn't really do anything about it. The Mayor Paul Soglin heard about it in his campaign, but hasn't done anything about it. And I think that we need to somehow get our elected officials to really make this a huge priority, because building 60 units a year isn't going to get us there. Building 100 units a year isn't going to get us there. We have to do more, and we have to change what our political will is. And that hasn't happened yet. It's closer than it's ever been, but it's not quite there yet.
And then we also have to flip the funding model on its head, because we know that it is way more expensive in order to maintain someone who is homeless on the street, and police services, court services, emergency room visits, all of these things add up. And estimates are anywhere from, I've seen anything from $20,000 to $80,000 a year for one person to be homeless on the streets. And the Section 8 voucher program is incredibly efficient. We can house families in Dane County for an average of $600 a month. Well, so that's what? Quick math, $7,200 a year. Compared to $20,000 at the low end, and that's an individual. I'm talking about housing a family. So, but the hard part is to say, well, should we lay off a bunch of cops and close a hospital so we can fund your affordable housing? I think that's what we get. You can't close all the shelters because there's still people that need the shelters. I get it, but what we are doing is way more expensive than what we are asking to do. And so if we have political will to say, well, let's spend our money on things that are helpful instead of pushing problems around and hiding them.
Well, and I just want to add, I mean, there are a lot of things we can do at the local level, but it really, I mean, it helps a lot if there's other levels of government, particularly levels of government that bring in a lot of additional revenue and could support us. And I think, you know, there's a sort of a misunderstanding, I think, about whose housing is most subsidized, right? Like, we spend by far the most amount of money in this country subsidizing you know, upper class homeowners with the mortgage interest deduction. And so it's important that people understand that. I'm not going to advocate for any change. I'm just saying it's important that people understand that that's really where a lot of our housing subsidy money is going to people who don't really need it.
Okay, we're at time, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it off. If you have another question, comment, please come up and join us here at the table. I just want to thank the sponsors again, Go Big Read, the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, all the authors of the report, the students of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, there you all are, and of course our panelists. Thank you for coming. A nice round of applause.